So I don't know if you know this, but Rick Steves, the travel guru, who tells you how to travel and what to travel and whatnot. Rick is actually a Lutheran, and so I found this great image on the web, but it says Rick Steves, Luther in the Reformation, because that was what he's written a lot about that. He's done some things, and he was very helpful when I went to Germany for the 500th anniversary of the Reformation in 2019. Um, but so what my sense is to talk about Luther, the Reformation, but then also what's happened. How did Lutheranism move and change and grow? And as I said, it's going to be a much more historical kind of context. What we really need to know is a little bit is how did and where did Lutheranism come from? And so to understand that, we have to understand that um, Lutheranism came from a world that was uh, really dominated by the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church was not only a religious influence, but it was a political power. It was it had doled out really um, uh, power, since Charlemagne, and the notion of the Holy Roman Emperor. It provided some kind of context for the people in power, and the church and the the lords, the rulers of different lands were highly influenced by what this Catholic Church had done, and so it's important to understand that the church was more than just a religious institution. It was uh, a powerful giver and kind of purveyor of political influence. Geopolitically, um, there were how should I say it? Europe was divided into some large kingdoms. The Holy Roman Emperor was a unique kind of confluence of, or the Holy Roman Empire was a confluence of northern Italy, of the kind of central lands of that included Germany, and a little bit east. There were some other powers, and large powers like the Austrian Empire. Um, uh, France itself was part of that, and there was actually some political wrangling between Rome and France, and for a while there were even two popes. One that was kind of provided by a pope elected out of Rome, and another by a pope elected out of a place in southern France. England itself was this kind of large empire, but again, it was broken up into um, smaller areas. And it's important to remember that we really didn't have the large nation state was not really part of that world yet. There were these large confluences, but largely things were run by small, um, smaller, you know, uh, areas of jurisdiction, and you had this was the era of you know castles and lords and paupers who kind of ran a certain area, and there were then all kinds of alliances and and uh, kind of battles that took place between these places. So this is a map of kind of how the lands were created. And you'll see, you'll see a lot of names there that look somewhat familiar. And you'll see, but you'll also see, a skewed um, place. You'll see like Spain is divided into three areas. You've probably even heard of those, Aragon and Iberia and Navarre, as well as then that peninsula had Portugal. You'll see that the area that we call Italy now is divided up into small states that are in there. And if you look in the middle there, right in here is what's called the Holy Roman Empire. And this is kind of the context of where Lutheranism was born. And you'll see here this little thing that says small states. The Holy Roman Emperor was elected by 7 electors. They were larger lords, or called electors. And they just kind of ran their own territories. So there was not this really confluence of large states, but these large or these smaller territories, these smaller kinds of areas that were run by different people who had armies. Armies were often filled with mercenaries, because that was a way to get out of your work as a pauper, is that you would become a soldier, and it gave you some more freedom and maybe some more money, but of course it came with lots of risks. But you would see people who made their living just simply by fighting and being part of an army. So that was kind of the geopolitical area that this happened, and it's one of the things that allowed the Reformation to happen. There were previous attempts to reform the church, especially in the 14th century. So that's the mid 1300s. One of them was John Wycliffe. He was in England, and in England, there, of course, there was this body of water that kind of separated, and we know about King Henry VIII and his disputes with the Pope. But they kind of wanted to run things, and politically were more independent. John Wycliffe was sent out to kind of negotiate some of that power, the secular power with the Roman Catholic Church, and he got really put off by the whole idea that actually people were put into church leadership, so they became bishops and cardinals largely by virtue of a nepotism kind of process, or who knows who, and it was not necessarily by their qualifications. And John Wycliffe became pretty upset about that, and when he came back, he spoke against some of the practices of the church that included the selling of indulgences, the whole notion that the church, kind of conveyed who was given grace and saved and whatnot, and as long as Wycliffe, kept his mouth on the theological and against Rome and the Roman Catholic Church, he was fine. But when he became a little bit more moved into the way of the church, and which sometimes challenged the secular authorities in England, he was much more silenced. But John Wycliffe was mid 1300s. Another major player was Jan Hus. Jan Hus was in Bohemia, so modern day Czechoslovakia area, Poland, east of Germany. Now this was an area that was actually much more dominated by the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The Holy Roman Empire ran that area, and so Jan also was much of the same things that Luther had protested. Jan Hus had protested, the selling of indulgences and the abuses of church power, and so unfortunately, Jan had been called down to a conference, a diet in Constantinople. He was promised safe passage, and when he got there, safe passage was revoked, and at that he was not only excommunicated but burned at the stake. And he was also a mid 1300s, so 14th century reformer. By the way, if there's anyone who has a question, either feel free to just blurt out or give some indication that you do. I can't see everybody.
Yeah, everyone is muted, pastors, but if anyone has a question or thought, just unmute yourself and state it, please.
The other major historical context that made a huge difference, that provided an opportunity for the Reformation to take place, was the invention of the printing press, which then allowed books and literature to be reproduced at a much higher rate. And while most of the population was still illiterate and couldn't read, it allowed information to go out much faster into the world. So that's kind of the historical context of where Martin Luther was born into. Martin Luther was born in the German states in the northeast side. If I go back to the area, this is kind of, no, actually not that far north. Oh, what do I do with it? Right in here is the area that Martin Luther did most of his ministry. So he was an Augustinian monk, priest, and professor. He didn't start off as that. His father was a miner, and the other thing I probably should have put into the context. There started becoming another class of people. So it wasn't just the aristocracy and the paupers and the soldiers, but there was a new class of people who were what's the name that was given of that? Basically, entrepreneurs who handled a profession. So there were, the smiths, who could form things. There were the miners. There were bankers. There was a whole kind of process that was happening as people gained kind of specialty professions. And Martin Luther's father was a miner, and Martin Luther was sent to the university by virtue of his father having some extra power and status, and he was sent to the university to become a lawyer. Pretty handy to have in the family, and the story says that he was in a storm one night, and that he was riding through the storm, and lightning and thunder was crashing down all around him, and in a fit he prayed to which saint? I forget which saint right now, but he kind of got on his knees and he promised his life to God. And as such, then he became a monk, and his father was very, very upset about that whole process. As he took on the role of an Augustinian monk, he was devout. He would go through hours and hours, and I was in the room where they would, meet in the morning with the confessor, And mostly it was, well, we do this and we get it done. Luther would keep them there because he would confess every little thing, and even those who were the confessors and in charge were kind of tired of his great devoutness. It is said that he would pray and he would flagellate himself and offer all kinds of things, and he would just be up endless amounts of time um, to do that. Kind of as a way of redirecting him, he was directed to become a priest, and then also then finally a professor, and he became a Bible scholar, and actually was an Old Testament scholar. Um, and during that time, he was moved from uh, where he was this Augustinian monk to a town called Wittenberg. He was given this Wittenberg assignment to be a professor at this new university. It wasn't a large or prestigious university. It seemed rather new, but it was something that was funded um, by one of the electors, and so he was there. Um, it was said that in 1519, on the eve of All Saints' Day, so All Hallowed Eve, which you might recognize, All Hallowed Eve is Halloween. That's where we get Halloween from. It's called All Hallowed Eve because it's on the day of what makes people holy, sainthood. So All Saints' Day, and the day starts with the eve before. Martin Luther had taken and had written several points of controversy that he was wanting to bring up in basically the academic format of a a debate, and those are called the 95 Theses. And is that day, October 31st, 1519, kind of marks the beginning and the anniversary of the Reformation. At least for Lutherans, it does. So, and he put that on the castle chapel door in Wittenberg. So every castle had its own chapel, where you didn't have to go out to have your church services done, and so that's where he did that, in Wittenberg. Over the course of time, he protested about the abuses of the church. He protested particularly about the selling of indulgences and the way of the church kind of saying that it had the power to proclaim, where one would go for eternity. And Luther, as he had studied more and more, became more informed. He said the Bible became this new source of authority, and he read through there that Jesus was a God whose grace and mercy were so miraculous that was the only way of salvation, and the only way that people could receive that is through faith. And so Luther created, and we'll be going through these three, kind of a symbol that you'll see in a lot of Lutheran works, the three solas. Sola means only, and sola scriptura, only by the scripture; sola gratia, only by grace; and sola fide, only by faith. And those became those things. Luther had become a pretty prolific writer. You know that he was a disciplined person, so he wrote a lot, and he went to what's called a diet, which is simply a conference. Again, he was offered safe passage, and if he had kind of known history, and he probably didn't even know who Jan Hus was, he probably would have been a little bit more um, uh, wary of going to this diet of Worms, which is in southern Germany, and there was this council, and essentially Luther was called to recant his writings, recant his beliefs, recant all these things. It is here that the kind of famous phrase that Luther is supposedly said is, unless by by reason or show of the Scripture, I can be shown wrong. Here I stand. I can say, I can bear no other kind of witness. And it was there he was excommunicated. And he would have probably died, except that he was kidnapped by friends. And some of those small state electors up in Germany who were looking for power saw him as an ally, and they kidnapped him, and he was saved, and he was hidden for a number of years in Wartburg Castle. He was kind of in exile there. He did his COVID thing in Wartburg Castle, and he kind of knocked around there, and he couldn't go out, and he couldn't go places because his life was in great jeopardy. And while he was there, he wrote the German Bible, and wrote many hymns and many of the things that we see. And so we find out that he was an avid author. He wrote books, he wrote treatises, all kinds of things. He translated the Bible into German, which was the vernacular, and he was a hymnodist, or somebody who wrote lots of hymns. Apparently, beer drinking was part of the culture, and going to the local tavern is where you would eat, oftentimes, and a lot of the hymns were sung to bar tunes that he put theological emphasis in. Later in his life, he advocated for, he saw the abuse of the kind of monastic orders. He helped, it is said that he and his cohort, he had a bunch of friends who were very powerful, some church leaders and some were secular leaders. They helped 11 nuns escape. Part of their role was then to get married to different people. A lot of priests who had taken this vow of celibacy. And though Luther really wasn't ready to get married, he was kind of like, well, you really kind of need to live by this. So Catherine von Bora became his wife. She was a number of years younger, and she was a nun. And really, she is part of a big part of his success. She kind of ran all the operations to keep him, and allowed him to continue to meet with people, and to speak with people, and to write, and to continue to be an influence. You'll also hear oftentimes about Martin Luther and his writings. There were some anti-Semitic words. I shouldn't say he was just an anti-Semite. He was actually looking for alliances, and try to coalesce with some of the local Jewish communities who were some of the local Jewish communities were some of the ran some of the businesses, and I'm still looking for what that word is. The kind of people who had created businesses and whatnot, and but Luther had always hoped that as soon as that they would be exposed to the gospel, that they would certainly convert. And when he ran into some opposition by some of those leaders, and when he realized that they didn't just convert, and they wanted to maintain their Jewish identity, that's when some of his really rants about Jews had come, and so he's got some bad knocks about that. but it's a much fuller story. He'd also written about uh, Muslims. He called them infidels. The the empire, or the Ottoman Empire, was always pressing up on the eastern edge of Europe, and was oftentimes uh, the influence. Actually, it kind of allowed the Reformation to flourish a little bit, because um, the Austrian Empire and the Austro-Hungary Empire had to put its military forces out on the east edge on the Ottoman Empire. But Luther oftentimes wrote about, just kind of like our reading today from Isaiah at the end, um, that they were there to kind of desolate all these infidels of the church. But Luther wrote, and is not known to be nuanced in terms of his understanding of Islam. Again, a lot of that can be seen as part of that age, and what he was privileged to know. What the historical and cultural premises were. Luther had certain things that he spoke about. Probably the one most often and most known about Luther, and probably the central key, is the whole notion that justification comes about by grace through faith, and not by any other means. That God provides our salvation by grace, and that we understand it through faith, and there's nothing that we can do to earn our own salvation. He talked a lot about law and gospel, and he would talk about that there are things that there is a purpose for the law, but it's not for our salvation. The law is largely so that we might know that we can't meet God's rules, and therefore we need God's grace, and so kind of how we fail. He is known for lifting up the authority of the Bible, especially as opposed to the authority of the church, and especially the authority of Rome, and the authority of the papal authority. And so there were a lot of abuses, and Luther, as a monk, had taken a pilgrimage into Rome, and he had realized that there were a lot of things that were meant to be holy were just really charlatan kind of efforts to gain money. And you would buy a little strip of wood that was a sliver of wood that somehow was said to be part of the cross, and things like that, and ultimately kind of realized that was a lot of that was just very much charlatan efforts. And so he gained this distrust of what the church was doing, and that was largely through the indulgences. You might also remember that St. Peter's was being built in Rome, and they needed money. They were out of money. And the indulgences created a great store of money. So Luther was one of those people who kind of inhibited the flow of money to Rome. So he became another enemy for that purpose. There are a lot of paradoxes. There are things that are kind of simultaneously true in Lutheranism. One of them is that we are simultaneously saints and sinners. That we are made saints by Jesus, but we are kind of at the same time sinful. So it's very different from people who say, I was saved at a certain date, and they'll talk about backsliding and things like that. For Luther, those things oftentimes and regularly happened simultaneously. Another belief was that there was a priesthood of all believers, that everybody, not just the clergy, not just the church appointed people, but everybody had some kind of role in terms of faithfulness and passing on faithfulness and on teaching scriptures and everything else. So the catechism, the small catechism that we're going to look at in a few weeks, was actually seen to be a book for parents to educate their children. It was not for the church to do, it was for the parents to do. We will talk more about predestination, but that was a big thing that became a place of, again, a place of conflict between the Roman Catholic Church, but then later became a doctrine of conflict between what was known as the other Reformed traditions that I'm going to show you in a few minutes. The conflict with the Catholic Church came in that there was the Sale of Indulgences. As I said, there was a need for funds, but there was also a need to somehow, it kept people under the grips of the church by offering them forgiveness, and ultimately the Sale of Indulgences became a way of kind of wiping out your debts. And if you had money, that was a great and nice and easy way, to feel like you were justified. You just went through the rite. It had become so widespread that the Sale of Indulgences was being done for ancestors, for other people that you loved, for for children, so they could get out of purgatory quicker and whatnot. So the Sale of Indulgences became, really one of the primary abuses that suggested that somehow our salvation was linked to what we would do. He had conflict about the primacy of the Pope and the tradition over Scripture, about where the authority of the church came from, and about the abuse and mythology of the church and the church aristocracy. Like Wycliffe, he saw that a lot of church positions were given by virtue of who you knew or who you were related to, and the church was hardly this place of being sacred. It was really just a place of power by which it became one of those kind of cush jobs. As Luther broke away from this, he gained power. What's important to understand is that Lutheran understanding really meant a lot, and it spread like wildfire as people became empowered, as people started being able to look at Scripture and read Scriptures, and in the past these books were sacred. They were put up in the church into the place where no one could go and no one would ever see them. As Lutheran ideas empowered people and allowed them to kind of come into play, that spread like wildfire. But the other thing that allowed it to spread is that politically there were people who challenged, and Luther was one of those people who challenged the power of the Catholic Church. And so being Lutheran became part of being a part of that protest, and therefore you get the word Protestant church. They were protesters, and they were bucking not only the Roman Catholic Church, but the powers that were in alliance with the Roman Catholic Church. So these electors, and it said there were 7 electors for the Holy Roman Empire. 3 of them, large people of influence, became associated with the Protestants, the Protestants, and kind of created this block. It became a political and economic block that stood in opposition to King Charles, and who was part of this empire that not only included the East but also Spain and then Belgium as well. But in the midst of that, other reformers came to the forefront. In Switzerland, John Calvin came, and eventually a lot of his theology went to Scotland, and therefore Presbyterian was kind of born of that. Another Swiss reformer was Zwingli, and its kind of evolution led to what's called the Reformed churches. And if you know that now Lutheranism is in altar and pulpit fellowship with both the Presbyterian and the Reformed churches. There were a few differences, and they were very powerful differences that kept them apart. There were Anabaptists, and Anabaptists largely became people who took the Bible and that ability to understand the Bible, myself, and Anabaptists largely didn't believe that there were clergy who had a powerful role. They became separatist communities, oftentimes communities that tried to become utopian, and they also became so Baptists and the Congregationalists, and they protested against the infant baptism because that wasn't in the Bible, and so that's where that came from. And kind of in a separate Reformation, but the Church of England was born as well. This was King Henry VIII, and this was again part of that English, and that was probably as much political as it was theological. But by having a church that somehow separated from Rome, it kind of made itself. Along that route, as a lot of Europe started becoming Protestant, and Protestantism started moving and growing, became a movement within the Catholic Church to counter that Reformation, and a lot of it was really good. It was stuff that really kind of got into making the church do really good theology again, but also became very disciplined. And out of that movement comes the Jesuits, and so Xavier Loyola, became one of those Jesuits, and part they're kind of that that order of the church became really involved with education, and also became very involved with the spread of Christianity, and was really there to kind of counter that Reformation. And it was really a powerful kind of reform that the Catholic Church had made, and so some of the later conferences were with people of this Counter-Reformation. But you can see the influence on education by all the varieties of, DePaul is a Jesuit, Loyola is named after a Jesuit. These are great, kind of examples of the church and the Counter-Reformation. Shortly after as I said, the Reformation partly happened because it was a political instance, and there were a lot of wars. There was a peasant uprising, and this is where kind of the ideal Lutheranism theology and the way it was carried out didn't always fit together, and Luther actually sided with the princes in the peasant revolution. But the peasants were empowered by the words of the Reformation, that that they had power, that they were somehow given the ability to make decisions, and that became kind of a terrible bloodbath. Shortly after these areas started growing, um, the 30 Years' War came, and that was largely, one of those political but religious. Kind of when you think about in our day, when we think about Ireland as being a religious war between Protestants and Catholics, um, it was much the same. It was, you know, religion was kind of placed on the label, but there was a lot of at stake in terms of economic and political power put in there, and it tells us a little bit about how Lutheranism had spread. Lutheranism had spread, and I think I'm going to get to that in the next thing, so I'll talk about that. Um, and then there became these, as I said, the peasant wars. There became this kind of diminution of Lutheranism and the Counter-Reformation, and there were places where Lutheranism had spread, and then it had really contrasted as these other influences challenged it. So, um, how did oh, so what I didn't put this in. Let me go back to um, the map here, and I'll show you a little bit more about kind of where Lutheranism spread and where it didn't. So Lutheranism started in this northern German kind of area. Well, it largely spread all through this area. The Bavaria part was pretty strongly, and remember, these were um, basically, if your lord or your prince um, sided with you, that's what was the religion of the whole area. So a lot of this depended on what your lord and prince. Lutheranism grew very large out into the east, out into Bohemia, and into Poland, and even down into what's presently Ukraine, um, down over here, you know. Um, and there's actually some parts that of very Eastern Europe that maintain that, but the Holy Roman Empire was remained in Catholic hands, and Charles V and the Austro-Hungarian Empire kind of grew, and these areas became uh, Catholic again, and they pushed it. So when we think of Poland, we don't think about the Protestant Reformation, but Lutheranism grew very well. Um, Prussia, you might remember, took over the Baltic kingdoms. So Lithuania is largely a Catholic stronghold. It's the southernmost of the Baltic states, but Estonia and Latvia are very heavily influenced by Lutheranism. Scandinavia became Lutheran, largely again as a way of kind of declaring independence. So there was a strong show in Denmark, but then it also grew and then into Sweden. And then, clearly there was some movement in England as England was, declaring its independence, and Scotland with Calvinism, and the Church of England in creating this. And so, what do we hear? We hear Anglo, English, Saxon, which is this part of Germany and kind of in the central part, having that power. So that's where Lutheran grew largely out this way, but then it was pushed back as this empire kind of gained strength. But the Scandinavian Empire became very strong, and during the 30 Years' War, Lutheranism may have been squashed in Germany except for King Gustav and the Scandinavian, the Swedish Empire, which was in cahoots with the Russian Empire as well. And there were other things happening during that time, Belgium, the Netherlands kind of got divided into the Netherlands and Belgium. Belgium became the Protestant kingdom, and Netherlands became the Swedish or the Catholic, and that was because of the relationship that Spain had. So so anyhow, geopolitically, it had it had grown a lot. Um, After this, Lutheranism was known for this kind of notion of becoming very orthodox. It had to figure out who it was. And so Luther had done a lot of writing, but Melanchthon, who was kind of his right hand man, had done a lot of the writing, and he had done a lot of the writing. He was kind of like the publisher and the editor, and he edited a lot, and ultimately wrote a lot of the what we'll learn about is the Book of Concord that identified what it means to be Lutheran. And so when I say orthodoxy, there became a right set of beliefs within Lutheranism, and it became kind of very somewhat rigid. So you might even think about, how we have roots in Missouri Synod. That orthodoxy kind of came out of of Missouri Synod, came out of orthodoxy. It also became a very intellectual church. Remember, Luther was a professor. He worked in a university. Um, so a lot of that became very intellectual. He was a Bible scholar. He looked at that. So the scholasticism and intellectualism became a role. One of the things that happened out of that, though, is there became this notion that it kind of lost. Lutheranism had lost some of its heart, and so a movement kind of in the 1700s, 1600s, 1700s came, and it was called Pietism, and it was largely it followed kind of what was happening in England with the Wesleyan Church, and there became these ways that people kind of said these are the disciplines that I need to do um, to feel that kind of power of, and so it became less about what you thought and more about what you did and how you felt, um, and ways that made the emotional parts of Lutheranism come around the 1700s. The realm of rationalism came through Europe, and Lutherans gravitated very much to that. You can think about that German notion of being of knowledge and scholasticism, and that whole understanding of rationalism, and so out of rationalism came all kinds of things that Luther actually in his stand at the Diet of Worms said, if I cannot by my own logic or by conviction of the scriptures. So logic has really become always part of the Lutheran tradition. And one of the things that happened with rationalism, though, is it got away from kind of the mysterious elements. It tried to understand everything, and then came a movement of an awakening, and so if you hear of like the Evangelical Free Church, um, this was a bunch of Lutherans who really kind of had broken away, much like we might think in England, and what we're maybe more familiar with in England was uh, the Pilgrims. They were the people who were breaking with the Church of England because they had become people who were um, um, much more pious and following those beliefs, and in England they had to get out of town because they were being convicted. So in parts of Germany, um, and parts of Scandinavia, this awakening movement and this Free Lutherans movement became evident. So when you think about Lutherans and the evangelical church that happened in Nazi Germany, the church became, again, very much part of the state. It was, the universities were sponsored by the state, the churches were sponsored by the state, and so Lutheranism, in a lot of ways, was part of the problem. But there were these free Lutherans, and Bonhoeffer, this famous Lutheran, is known. He was more of the free Lutheran kind of movement. So here's the one. Lutheranism, as I said, lived in northern and eastern Germany, and it's called Low Germany because it's the lowlands, not the Alps. It moved to Scandinavia. It moved to Eastern Europe, as I showed you. It moved a little bit to Western Europe, but it was hindered by the Franco kingdom, the kingdom of France, and England had its own thing kind of going. So the influence of Lutheran thinking happened in England, but it didn't stay there. And then it expanded to other parts of the world. Remember, Germany was not one of those imperial. So the Reformation came in the 1500s. That was the time when the world was becoming very imperialistic, and the countries with great navies were exploring parts of the world. So you had Spain, and you had England, who were claiming these parts. Germany was not part of that because it was much more landlocked. So Lutheranism did not expand, but Germany became part of this world, and as it grew and as it had world influence, it also grew and expanded, and so it did go into the New World. So Lutheranism in America came about at first from some German imperialism. Again, a lot of the German, northern German, the Anglo-Saxon area, Germans came in and they settled in a place called New Amsterdam, which is New York. And our earliest kind of settlements of Lutheranism in this country happened in the Northeast. So there was a strong areas in New York and in Pennsylvania, where you hear about the Pennsylvania Dutch. Those were the Lutherans, and that kind of area. But it really didn't grow. It didn't, capitalize, and it didn't grow a whole lot. There were some settlements and areas in the South. So in the Carolinas, there were some Lutheran areas. Gradually, Lutheranism came to the country largely by virtue of immigration and cultural religion. And what I mean by that is, as different parts of Europe had to move for whatever reasons, out of poverty, out of hope for new lands and whatnot, it came over, and Lutheran churches settled along with their cultural identities. So the Lutheran churches kind of were part of, the Swedes or the Norwegians or the Danes or the Germans, and they settled in these areas. And so there's a road out in Burr Ridge, and it's called Old German Church Road. I love that road, and it just means there was a German-speaking church down there. And when you see a lot of first English Lutheran churches, that just simply means that they were the first church in town to do their services in English, because they largely weren't there. But originally, every community that came was largely a cultural identity, and their church became part of that cultural identity. And so a lot of churches were known by, what they were. I went to Augustana College, and Augustana was that Swedish um, place where a lot of Swedes lived. Swedes lived moved to like Rockford. I learned the Norwegians moved to a lot of Wisconsin, except there was this German area in Milwaukee. Um, and then you have a lot of Swedes in Minnesota, in the northern parts. There were also in Texas. I didn't realize that there were Germans that settled down there, but there's some German areas that are very strong, and you hear like Fredericksburg and what are some of the other areas that sound like they are very German. Gradually, as people became acculturated and what it meant to be Swedish or German or Norwegian or Danish didn't mean as much anymore as we became more American. Um, it meant though those churches oftentimes became you didn't need three different Lutheran churches on a corner, and there could be one Lutheran church where people would go because they didn't identify uh, by their their European nationality, but they identified by the community. They identified by the work in the community or whatever, and so there was a lot of mergers in the late 1950s and early 60s. You had two really big mergers happen, and that was that Norwegian church, a section of the Danish church, a German faction, and another faction formed the American Lutheran Church in America. It was much less hierarchical. There was also the Swedes, a group of Germans, especially the old Germans from out east. Another group of Germans, Danish and the Finnish, gathered, and they became the Lutheran Church in America, the LCA. Um, then a little bit later, especially because of the separation of the Missouri Synod and the Association of Evangelical Lutheran Churches, it kind of formulated uh, that even those separations were not necessary, and so the church continued to merge, and so the Evangelical Lutheran Church was formed out of the American Lutheran Church, the Lutheran Church in America, and the Association of Evangelical Lutheran Churches. Um, it's funny how all those initials kind of formulated. Um, in the midst of Lutherans, though, there are still continue to be splits. So we've seen splits happen, within religiously right-leaning understandings of Lutheranism as well as the left. Most recently, the ELC has seen the biggest split come in the end of 2009 when it wrote the new statement on sexuality and gender, and allowed for Lutheran pastors who are gay and practicing to continue to be called into the church, and where the church kind of authorized and said congregations could accept homosexuality and perform marriages in the church and whatnot. Um, so we've seen that, and that's kind of created kind of where we're at now. And probably the biggest challenge right now for Lutheranism is intellectually, again sounds it remains pretty strong, but it doesn't have those practices that create emotional power in them. So you think about what some of these other churches that do that. It doesn't have a need right now to be a cultural institution because most people don't identify with a European, their European culture. But you see a lot of religious organizations that do remain. So you see a lot of growth of mosques, which is no different than what the Lutheran Church had done. And so mosques are oftentimes culturally connected. You know, this was the Pakistani mosque. This is the mosque where, you know, you find a lot of Serbians or Macedonians or um, um, you know, parts from different parts of the world. Um, as I think as you know, more communities of Indian descent form, you see a lot more temples growing as well in our nation, and so they become, you know, receptacles of culture as well as of the religion. So that's all I have for today. Any thoughts, questions, responses? Yeah, Rick.
Hey, Pastor. I mean, just one question that I had. You talked about um, Luther's authority of the Bible, right?
Uh huh.
And I guess I'm wondering how you believe that outlook of the Bible being the authority. I don't know if you mean if that's a literal authority, but how you reconcile Luther's authority of the Bible with some of the uh, teachings in the ELCA about more interpretations of the Bible than a literal reading of the Bible.
Um, I think, you know, as I had one professor who said, you know, as we read the Bible, you know, who really is reading literally? Sometimes we read the Bible, and when we get to the section on the Bible, I'll get into this a lot more.
Right.
When we read the Bible, we oftentimes read it as a 20th century or 21st century English piece of literature.
Yes.
It's not.
Right.
It's a collection of books that were written for about 2,000 years in various parts of largely the Middle East and Southern Europe um, and Northern Africa. And those how we read that is sometimes misunderstood. It was also a variety of different writings. Um, it was also a variety of different writings that spoke to certain specific needs that were in the presented, and so when we speak about how the Bible speaks to that kind of thing, we have to say, well, the cultural and contextual situation is maybe not, you know, that it was writing to at that time is different than what it is now. And as we were just talking about this, you know, um, what is oftentimes, like, for example, the issue of homosexuality, what is identified as homosexuality in the Bible is a far different um, contextual um, situation than what it is now. Homosexuality in the Bible was oftentimes really part of slavery, and it was part of a power context, and had less to do with gender and more to do with you know, with abuses that were happening within, you know, and so you know uh, it was, you know, the problem is it would speak, you know, the Bible, because of its cultural thing, it did, and the role of women, it didn't ever even speak about, you know, the rapes and that happened amongst women, but it would speak about the rapes that would happen amongst men. um, but what it gives us clue to is that there were rape was kind of a normal, typical thing in society, and the Bible was speaking against that. So,
Yes,
you
sir.
have to kind of look at what the context is, and so my Bible professor would say we're really the literalists, even because what we're trying to understand is what the Bible literally said to its time and place, and then we're trying to understand what does that mean for us.
Thanks, Pastor. I enjoyed this. That was good. Good recap historically.
Any other comments, questions? So next week we'll get into a little bit more of the beliefs of and some of those early kind of um, foundational beliefs, and I think it should be a little bit more interesting, especially being I think in person I'll be able to read the room a little bit better. But yeah, it'll be much more specific to what we what we believe as Lutherans. But this is just kind of that context to understand where it came out of and kind of how it's grown.
Well, Pastor, our battery went low, so we're with Dorothy now, but I think all of us thought it was great to learn more about where this Lutheranism came from. So we just wanted to thank you again and again.
Well, thank you. I'm glad you could come. I'm glad you stayed on in Florida. I guess the weather's cooperating with staying in. Yeah, well, like I said, it should get a little bit more specific into kind of our Lutheran understandings and beliefs next week.
It was kind of neat to hear. I'm Pennsylvania Dutch.
Okay.
And
so you're German. I was like,
yes, I'm German.
Who are the Pennsylvania Dutch? Why do we worry about the Dutch, and why are there so many Lutherans coming out of there? And all of a sudden you realize it's not Dutch, it's Deutsch.
Deutsch.
It's Pennsylvania Deutsch, and Deutschland is Germany.
Is Mom still on? Jan, are you still on? Because I think.
Oh yeah, well, her site's here.
There she is. Mom, are we high German or low German? She can't unmute. Oh, she's on mute.
Yeah.
Unmute yourself, Mom.
Jan, are you high German or low German?
Still muted.
Rick, can you unmute her?
Well, I can ask for her to unmute. That's all I can do.
Oh.
Okay.
There she
There
is.
you go.
Okay.
Now I
Now,
can hear you.
I don't know if I'm high or low German from Yugoslavia, though.
We're from Yugoslavia.
We'll have to get out.
Yugoslavia, which is that now. That's an interesting. That's part of that
Yeah.
Austro-Hungarian Empire that grew in that area. So yeah, I don't know what that would be because I would imagine. I think a lot of the tradespeople actually moved, to different parts of the world, and Germans were, led in those tradespeople, and so they immigrated to a lot of different parts where there was economic opportunity. So there was a lot of industrialization that happened in Germany that could be, that would move to different parts of the world.
And most of those people that came over, his mother came over with six children, and they all were Catholics.
Ah.
And I
Okay.
became Lutheranism. My mother was Lutheran, and he kind of left the education to her as far as religion went. But everybody I knew were Catholic.
So my German grandfather, my father's father, came, and he originally was in Bavaria, so he was Catholic. So that was in the Alps and in the southern part, but the highlands. My mother was part of my father's mother came from the lowlands, and then.
What was the difference between high and low? I mean, they never spoke of it.
High and low, I think it had some sense of high and low in terms of socialization, but it was largely high. The highlands were the Alps, the mountains and the hills, and the lowlands were the plains and the valleys and the rivers. And we think, when we think high and low, we think kind of north south, but the lowlands, the low Germany is the north part.
Well, my grandma was born in Austria, and when I was a child, she took me on Belmont Avenue in Chicago, there at St. Paul's, I think Lutheran Church, and it German. They spoke. They had a German service, and then
Wow.
they dressed up in their. Every once in a while, they dressed up in their long dresses. I have a picture of her. Some fest. I don't know what it was, but I was
Sure.
too young to know. So
Yeah, you
that
should
was-
bring that in and let us see it. That'd be cool.
Yeah, it is.
Okay,
Very cool.
all right.
And
It's
as you became much more familiar with speaking English, and probably German was, maybe what was spoken at home, that's why the churches started speaking English. It was like the contemporary church. It's like, what kind of music are we going to have? It's like that was a huge split. I mean, whether they were going to break with the native language and speak English or stay with, this is sacred, German or Swedish or Norwegian. Those were the sacred languages.
Very cool.
I know we spoke German at home. Most of the relatives were German and spoke German. So when I got into high school, I took German, 3 years of German, so I would know what they're talking
Wow.
Yeah, they talked in German when they didn't want me to know what they were saying.
about.
Wow.
The most dangerous generation is always the bilingual generation, the one that knows both.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, Pastor, thank you. Enjoyed
All
that.
right.
Thank you.
We'll see you all next week.
Yep, I even took
Florida
notes.
people will see you next week, huh? What did you say?
I said I even took notes.
Oh, okay. Michelle, it's nice to see you. How's Christian?
He's doing much better. Thank you.
Good.
Glad to hear that.
Yeah, glad to hear that.
Well, it's nice to see your name in front of us. You're so much a part of us, and as Marie, is so much a part of us.
Always will.
Thank you so much.
All right. Well, God bless you. We'll see you next week.
Sounds
Okay.
good.
In Rolling Meadows.
Thanks, Paul.
Yeah.
Stay warm.
Dorothy,